Hello and welcome to the second keynote session of the Analysys Mason Telecoms Summit. My name is David McElroy, a session moderator, and I'm delighted to introduce this keynote session's presenters, Research Director Stephen Sale and Research Partner Tom Rebeck. Before we start this session looking at the post-pandemic landscape and the impact of COVID-19 and the opportunities for telecoms operators, I'd like to let you know that we welcome your questions throughout the session. You can submit your questions in the Q&A widget, and if we don't have time to answer all of your questions during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, a member of our team will follow up directly with you after the event. You're unable to download copies of the slides. However, this session will be available on demand in about 1 or 2 hours' time. Now, I'll pass you straight over to Tom. So Tom, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks David. So in this presentation, Stephen and I will look at the impact of COVID-19 on the telecom sector, focusing on some of the more significant issues. We're going to be looking mostly from a service and revenue perspective, so we aren't going to be talking about how it's changed network capex or other impacts on cost. We do have other sessions at the summit that will tackle those issues in more detail. Let's first of all look at the financial performance of operators during 2020 so far. They've actually done pretty well and better than we had expected. The yellow circles and lines in this chart represent GDP growth figures for each country, and the blue circles and lines are the revenue growth figures for the named operators. We've used domestic revenue for each operator, so for Orange, the figure is for Orange France, and so on. As we're all aware, the GDP performance has been poor almost everywhere. China's the only country in this sample to have grown. All other countries have been in recession, and there have been some dramatic falls in output, such as in the UK, South Africa and Malaysia. Telecoms has held up well though. The operators shown here have performed better than the broader economy in almost all cases. There are some exceptions. For example, TIM's revenue fell faster than the Italian GDP, but this reflects longer term issues at TIM, not just COVID. 4 of the 9 operators even managed to grow revenue in the last year, and this includes MTN in South Africa, despite the 17% decline in the economy there. The results relative to GDP are not a huge surprise. The telecom sector is typically resilient during a crisis, as we saw in 2008, and this time round, telecoms has been even more critical in keeping the economy going. There are still some risks, as we'll talk about later on, but overall, it's a pretty reassuring picture. Now turn to profitability. Here, it's hard to see any impact of COVID-19 on operator results. Of the 9 operators in this sample, margins grew for 3 of them, were flat for 3 of them, and declined for 3 of them. If you take the simple average of the EBITDA margins from this sample, 2020 is almost identical to 2019. This result is because COVID has had a balancing impact on operator finances. For example, the loss of roaming revenue hurt margins, but closing shops, as most operators have done for at least some of the time, will have boosted margins. Most operators reiterated their full-year EBITDA guidance in recent earnings announcements. Deutsche Telekom has even raised its expectations for EBITDA. Again, this is a more favourable outcome than we would have expected earlier in the year. We'll now explore how the pandemic is changing the telecoms market in some more detail. We've split the impact into 4 types shown here. Firstly, there are the areas in which 2020 looks much like 2019. Previous trends have continued. Second, there are areas which have been hit by the crisis but should bounce back. The more interesting points are numbers 3 and 4. The third area is existing trends accelerated by the pandemic. Finally, there are areas where we expect the pandemic to have a longer lasting impact. We'll touch on the first 2 areas in the next few slides, but focus more on the last 2 points.
So, as already mentioned, telecoms is relatively resilient during economic downturns in general, and during this one in particular, characterised so far by state support for people to stay at home. Many parts of the operator business have carried on much as before. Fixed broadband, for example, has provided a steady line of revenue during the pandemic. This is a continuation of the existing trend. It's been growing steadily for many operators in recent quarters, largely driven by fibre rollout, and little has changed in 2020. The chart shows the quarterly growth in fixed broadband connections for a selection of incumbent operators. The onset of the pandemic hasn't made much of a difference to overall trends. Most operators were able to carry on connecting new households during lockdowns. There have been some clear short-term impacts on the telecoms business, however. These have been significant in terms of revenue impact, but will recover, even if in some cases there will be a period of readjustment. We've presented some of the main ones here. Device sales, notably handsets, are a major revenue source for most operators. Device revenue can account for as much as 20% of total mobile revenue for some, though much less in emerging markets. Device sales have been affected by the closure of stores, as well as by a reduction in discretionary spend on bigger ticket items. Most operators have reported revenue decline for this line item. The orange figures reported here are typical. It's important to note that this is not a very profitable part of the operator's business, and in many cases a decline in revenue has resulted in an increase in profit. Many operators have ascribed a poor third quarter to the delayed iPhone launch, itself a result of COVID-19 too. Operators will be aiming to be back on track for the all-important Christmas period coming up. Roaming, of course, has been badly hit as international travel has ground to a halt. Roaming revenue is typically around 5% of mobile service revenues, though it varies between operators and countries. A 90% reduction during the first lockdown period was normal, with some improvement during the summer. The travel sector will take a long time to recover, but operators will be glad to report year-on-year growth once more from around April next year. Roaming is very profitable, and this has hurt the bottom line. The postpaid mobile sector has been fairly resilient, but the prepaid sector has been much more volatile. Operators in Europe and in particular the USA have much less exposure on prepaid, but in emerging markets, however, the exposure is very high. There were some short-term issues with top-up, with the closure of shops and agents, but these have been largely overcome. The effects on prepaid ARPU have been mixed. Some operators have reported a decrease in spend levels, while others have reported increased data consumption. A major pain point for many operators has been the loss of prepaid subscribers, either in the form of tourists that never came, or more starkly with migrant workers that returned home. The Middle East has been particularly vulnerable. Etisalat in the UAE reported a 10% decline in prepaid subscribers in the second quarter. Most customers were relatively low ARPU, but subscriber losses of that scale hurt. The last revenue line to mention here is content revenue. While content consumption has been generally higher in 2020, I will return to this shortly, many operators have been exposed to the loss of live sport broadcasting. Sky lost 214,000 customers in the second quarter and reported a 13% decline in revenue. This was attributed to customer losses, lower sports content revenue, and a decrease in advertising revenue. We'll now turn our attention to some of the longer-term consequences of COVID-19 on telecoms. We'll first look at some of the trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic. Operators are generally well positioned to act on these, but need to execute well. And then we'll look at some of the more radical disjunctures associated with the pandemic, some trends that are more disruptive in nature. So the first accelerated trend is the adoption of digital channels. Operators have been moving in this direction for some time, and it features in some form in most operators' main strategic objectives. Operators are typically trying to balance and improve customer experience via digital channels with cost savings, as these channels substitute for call centre usage and in-person visits to stores. For many operators, a large retail presence has been an historical strength. For example, with 1 million points of sale across Asia through its distributor network, Telenor has boasted of its presence in almost every village in its country footprint. The general question of how to retain that advantage in digital has been made more acute by the pandemic. Digital channels have been mission critical for operators during lockdowns, and operators with already successful digital experience strategies have been well positioned. As for the effects of the pandemic, we've been tracking the adoption of digital channels through our primary research work in the connected consumer. We found that the penetration of self-care apps has increased during 2020, though perhaps not by as much as you would expect, generally single-digit percentage points. Where we did see the most change was in terms of engagement with those apps. This chart shows the proportion of respondents for the UK mobile operators that reported that they would use their Selfcare app as the first port of call for a sales interaction. You can see that last year's numbers were pretty low. There's been a big boost in the willingness of customers to use these channels in 2020. That's good news, but there's more work to be done. Operators will need to do more to drive penetration of their self-care apps. We surveyed customers in 24 countries, and in those countries, very few operators had over 50% penetration. Many are still around 20%, even at this stage of the pandemic. It will be critical to drive penetration to reach other segments. Operators might need to incentivize usage, potentially tying into loyalty schemes and payment platforms and so on. I mentioned cost savings as an important driver of digital experience initiatives. With continued revenue pressures, operators will be under even more pressure to focus on costs. A few data points. Vodafone reduced customer care costs by 10% year-on-year in the second and third quarters of 2020, contributing 0.3 billion euros of cost savings. Telenor reported an 8% OPEX reduction in the third quarter, with digital channels playing a major role. There's many more examples. But I think importantly, operators are keen to lock in the behavioural changes of 2020 and to continue to deliver cost savings through digital experience initiatives. One of the most well-documented effects of the pandemic has been a big increase in screen time. Most people have had to spend more time at home, and much of our attention has been directed at screens of various kinds. Ofcom reported that average screen time in the UK was 6 hours and 25 minutes in April, a year-on-year increase of 31%. 2-hour increases in screen time are quite common in other countries too. If we look at the mix of content consumption, our Connected Consumer survey suggests that broadcast viewing has stayed reasonably level, but on-demand viewing has grown significantly. In particular, OTT video usage has increased. New players such as Disney Plus have increased consumer choice, and consumer willingness to spend money on OTT video has also increased. Netflix reported a record quarter in the first Q 2020 with nearly 16 million paying net ads. New forms of video consumption have also grown. Twitch, the live stream platform mainly associated with gaming and esports, reported a 55% increase in viewership in the second quarter of 2020. 2020 has been quite a year for gaming. Records have been broken across pretty much all metrics: higher downloads, higher engagement, and higher levels of in-game purchases. Just to call out a few examples. Steam is the largest distribution platform for PC gaming. It recorded 20 million concurrent users in March. New game releases have done extremely well. The family-friendly Animal Crossing New Horizons was a major sensation during lockdown. Call of Duty Warzone, released in March, is currently the fastest-growing non-mobile title of all time. And major cloud gaming services have come to market, launched by Microsoft on the Game Pass Ultimate plans, and Amazon with its Luna platform. So here we can see a shift towards online consumption of entertainment content, and one that is likely to stay. Operators can do more to address this opportunity. They are well positioned to benefit from increased demand for performance connectivity. This could be simply a case of speed-up selling, or it could be a more formal offer, such as a gamer package. Secondly, bundling. Offering consumers flexibility and choice is key in the video market. Operators can act as aggregators, allowing consumers to choose who they buy content from, whilst also mediating and controlling those relationships. I like the approach taken by TDC and a few others based around service tiers that facilitate service swapping while maintaining spend levels. There are also opportunities to provide differentiated viewing experiences with multi-view options, analytic overlays, social integration, and so on. Finally, there are opportunities in gaming. Cloud gaming in particular offers a strong role for operators since it is so reliant on performance connectivity. Tune in to Martin Scott and Giulio Sinibaldi's session tomorrow to find out more about operator strategies in gaming, VR, and more. The third accelerated trend that we want to cover is convergence. We already mentioned the strength of the fixed broadband business. Integrated operators have been able to offset volatility in mobile with a strong performance in fixed. We can illustrate the effects on the converged player with some reporting from Orange France. Average spend for converged customers, shown here as the blue line, has held up well during 2020 with continued growth over the quarters. These customers account for over half of Orange's fixed broadband base. Spend levels for fixed-only customers, the orange line here, have been trending down for quite a while, but there's a slight uptick in the second quarter at the height of the pandemic. Mobile-only customer spend, the green line, has been fairly flat historically, but these customers decreased their spend in the first and second quarters, largely due to roaming and other factors that we mentioned earlier. Importantly, the value of customers with bundled fixed and mobile held steady despite these short-term impacts. The Convergence is not a new strategy. Many other operators are committed to this approach, but the pandemic reinforces some of the benefits of this strategy. We've got some recent quotes to support this. Deutsche Telekom, a long-term advocate of FMC, says that convergence is resilience during the pandemic. In a different market context, Maxis and Malaysia say that they are doubling down on convergence. The major impetus underpinning retail convergence at the moment is fibre upsell. Many operators have reported strong net adds for FTTH during 2020. Orange, I've just been talking about, reported a record quarter in 3Q with 360,000 FTTH net adds. We've got a session dedicated to fibre investment later on today with Rupert Wood, so I'll leave it to him to talk about some more. Another major focus for operators is building up the in-home proposition. Ensuring better Wi-Fi connectivity is a good starting point. And security is also increasingly important as more devices come on stream and more activities take place at home. The pandemic has given operators more leverage than previously in the smart home segment. Stephen Wilson is doing a session on addressing the in-home opportunity, also later today.
If we now turn to business services, an area of accelerated usage has been voice and unified communications. Catherine Hammond will talk more about this in her business session tomorrow, but I'll just pick up on some of the key points here. We see data on increased usage from several sources, including a survey we did earlier in the year. During April and May, 28% of small and medium-sized businesses started using collaboration tools for the first time, and most of these expect to continue usage post-pandemic. Operators seem to be taking a reasonable share of this growth, as we can see from this chart. On the left-hand side, we have the growth in VoIP connections for operators, and on the right, we show growth in revenue for 8x8 and RingCentral, two providers of cloud communication service. The data is not perfectly comparable, as we only have connection numbers for the operators and revenue numbers for the two vendors, but it's good enough for the purposes here. Also, point on the chart, I've rebased the data to Q1 2020 so that the different values are comparable. 2 points stand out from this slide. Firstly, the increase in usage hasn't led to an acceleration in spending. Growth rates for 2020 are in line with what we saw in 2019. This is, though, a continued strong performance despite all of the economic uncertainty. Secondly, the operators have done about as well as the cloud communication vendors. The performance of BT, Gamma and KPN compares favourably with 8x8 and RingCentral. Orange hasn't had the growth of the other three operators, but this was also true in 2019. Now, obviously, I haven't included Zoom on this slide, and we'll talk more about it in tomorrow's session. Zoom, as we all know, has had a phenomenal year, but this was mostly due to its meetings products. It does have Zoom Phone, which is more of a direct competitor to the solutions shown here, but Zoom Phone is still relatively a small part of its business. So, to close on this slide, for cloud-based business voice services, operators have performed relatively well in 2020. Let's look now more broadly at cloud services. In April 2020, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said that he had seen 2 years' worth of digital transformation in 2 months. We don't quite see this in our data, but there are strong signs of accelerated take-up of cloud services. The 2 data points on the left of the slide are from the survey of businesses that we did earlier in the year. As well as higher usage of cloud collaboration and security during the pandemic, over 20% of businesses were expecting these higher usage levels to continue post-pandemic, and over 10% were also expecting spend levels to be higher. Overall, we expect the pandemic to accelerate the take-up and usage of digital and cloud services. This increased usage may not result in accelerated spending, but will at least help maintain already high growth rates. The chart on the right-hand side compares the performance in the first 9 months of 2020 with the performance in the same period in 2019 for various cloud players and the cloud revenue of telecoms operators. These operators have done mostly well in 2020, and the performance in cloud has far outstripped most other business revenue lines. But for most operators, these fall short of the levels of growth seen by AWS, Google Cloud, and Salesforce. You could argue that the operator figures and the cloud vendor figures aren't directly comparable, and of course this is true, But for most operators, the numbers shown here are what they are describing as cloud or cloud services, so there shouldn't be too much dilution with slower growing legacy IT products. Operators are aggressively targeting cloud as an expansion area. For example, TIM is planning to carve out its cloud and data center business. It's aiming for 20% year-on-year increases for this unit in the next 5 years. Telefonica made a similar move in creating a cloud entity as part of its Telefonica tech restructuring. This also has ambitious revenue targets. Despite this ambition, the truth may be that even though telecoms operators are doing well in cloud, they are nevertheless falling behind others.
Now, we'll turn our attention to more disruptive trends that potentially ask more questions of operators' capabilities and positioning. As we've already seen, apart from a few vulnerable areas, consumer telecoms has been largely unaffected by a reining in of spend amid the pandemic. Consumers have shifted spend from travel, eating out, social events and so on to communications, connectivity and entertainment. This highlights telecoms' role as a utility during this unprecedented crisis, but I think we can go further here. I think a useful concept from economics that we could apply is affordable luxuries. Consumers cut back on big-ticket items, but will often allow themselves small luxuries, little treats. A classic example is beauty products, which have defied consumer spending trends in previous downturns. One could plausibly argue that a subscription to Disney Plus or Netflix or buying a new gaming title could come into this category. Operators are providing essentials as connectivity providers, but they're also in the value chain for some affordable luxuries or selling them directly themselves, so in a relatively good place. However, there is a concern that as we move from a public health crisis to its aftermath, an economic crisis, that some of this spend might come under more pressure. Many countries face large-scale unemployment, which is surely likely to have some effect. One hypothesis that we've been exploring is whether there is increased price sensitivity among consumers faced with a worsening economy. We have data from the Connected Consumer Survey that measures attitudes before and during COVID. The overall data doesn't show us a clear picture, which is interesting in itself, but we've tried to dig a little deeper on a cohort that might be worst affected, young people in the US, where unemployment rates are already very high. We've seen that price satisfaction amongst this group has decreased. The scale here is from 1 to 5, with 1 as very dissatisfied and 5 as very satisfied. So you can see that the price satisfaction has decreased, but only slightly. And it hasn't negatively affected the headline metrics of Net Promoter Score, for instance. The NPS among this cohort is up slightly year on year. And the intention to churn has even decreased from around 12% in 3Q 2019 to just under 11% in 3Q 2020. However, price as a motivator among potential churners has increased, with 38% of churners citing it as a factor. So we don't see a strong effect of price sensitivity, but I do think we see a degree of caution among customers. Price will play more of a role in churn decisions, but the lower level of intention to churn suggests that these consumers are less likely to commit to new plans right now. So drawing back to make a more general point, the guiding principle for operators at this time, I think, is flexibility. Customers may value the service and be willing to pay more for some extras, but don't want to commit on an ongoing basis. A 24-month contract is pretty unappealing right now, given the economic uncertainty. Operators would do well to understand this if they want to maximise the value of the customer. A good example is Deutsche Telekom's Magenta 1 Plus, an unlimited data plan across both fixed and mobile, available on a rolling monthly basis. We think we'll see a lot more rolling monthly plans.
In contrast to consumer spending, which, as Stephen has said, is stable, business spending on telecoms has been hit hard by the pandemic, and the outlook is uncertain. This is a major disruption from 2019. When we looked at the revenue of operator business divisions a year ago, the overall outlook was positive. After years of revenue decline, it was looking as though the market had bottomed out and that many operators were starting to grow B2B revenue once again. This chart shows the performance in the third quarter of 2020 compared to the third quarter of 2019 for 9 operators. A fall in the range of 2 to 4% is typical, and some are doing worse. These falls are mostly due to declines in usage and not declines in connection numbers. Most telecom spending by businesses is locked into contracts. This means that it's hard for them to reduce spend quickly. The open question is what will happen during 2021. Will we see declines in connection numbers? Government funding has helped many businesses that would otherwise have gone bankrupt to stay afloat. Indeed, the bankruptcy rate for most of these countries was below historic levels in 2020. This has meant that most companies have kept paying their phone bill even if they weren't thriving. Hopefully, as we move into 2021, vaccines will be distributed, economic confidence will return, and these businesses will survive even after government support stops. But I think there's a real risk that many businesses will stop trading or that they will have to make major cuts to survive. For example, we've already heard of many retailers permanently shutting shops. This may all have a knock-on effect on the revenue for the business divisions. For some operators, it may be that the situation in 2021 gets worse before it gets better. That was all probably a bit gloomy, but there are areas where spend is growing and where there are new opportunities appearing for operators. Most operators don't break out their business revenue by sector, but Verizon usefully does. As you can see from this chart, increased government spending in 2020 has caused a significant uptick in Verizon's public sector revenue. I don't think Verizon is alone in seeing this sort of increase. Moving to 2021, other stimulus packages from government, such as the EU's €750 billion plan, may also find their way to operators and help at least partially offset declines elsewhere.
The third disruptive trend moves beyond the entertainment consumption that we discussed earlier to consider a new set of activities that are moving online and that will persist to some degree. Firstly, a host of concerts, festivals, sports and cultural events have had to happen virtually this year. This has generally taken the form of live streaming to consumers at home. Part of the growth in Twitch that I mentioned earlier in 2020 has been due to the platform's suitability for hosting these kinds of events, in addition to its core gaming and esports propositions. Now that both audiences and performers and organisers have got used to these new forms of interaction, they will probably continue in some form as in-person physical events start to happen again. You can imagine that a major music festival taking place in 2022 will probably have a strong digital component. It's a way to address larger audiences and to offer new experiences. Enhancing experiences with virtual reality appears a bit more tangible now. The kinds of services on offer in South Korea seem more replicable in other market contexts. Consumers have valued the integration of social features when playing games or watching videos together online. SK Telecom's Jump VR includes a virtual living room for friends to enjoy experiences such as watching a football match together. O2 UK has a partnership with Melody VR that includes live concerts in multi-view and 360-degree video. Other activities that have begun the move to virtual provision include healthcare. COVID-19 has prompted different parts of the healthcare value chain to prioritise e-health as a means to improve accessibility of healthcare services while improving the cost of delivery. These moves have been enabled by the proliferation of smartphones and wearable devices, but also by the rise of health finance and e-commerce and the digitalising of health data. In many countries, previously restrictive regulation has been broadened to encompass online consultations of different forms. Telecoms operators can play a range of roles in e-health. Some are working with partners to support remote consultations, such as Telefónica's Sulu service. In India, Reliance Jio has a full spectrum approach with its Health Hub, health and wellness portal for managing health data and connecting with healthcare providers. Telstra has a long history of involvement in healthcare and offers a broad range of services, generally B2B. The education sector is going through a similar experience. Many schools and universities have moved to online provision out of necessity, but some hybrid learning models are likely to remain in place after the pandemic. Many operators are exploring opportunities in this sector, mainly at this stage with investments in edtech providers. Examples include Airtel, AT&T, Telenor and Telefonica.
Some of the points Stephen made on the previous slide may be a bit long-term or may not be relevant to all operators. There are, though, some short-term opportunities arising from the way work is changing. The shift to remote working we've seen in 2020 is likely to stay. Some big companies like Fujitsu, Twitter and others have committed to supporting remote working permanently. Similar changes are also happening with smaller organisations. 71% of small and medium-sized businesses told our survey that they expect to allow more working from home post-pandemic. This changes the nature of the opportunity for operators active in the business market. Pre-pandemic, the focus for many was on providing connectivity to business sites like offices. In a world where many people are working from home, the focus for operators needs to change. The move to cloud only makes this change more critical. In high-income countries, customers will typically already have a broadband connection at home. Some operators are offering a second fixed-line connection for the home, but the demand for this will probably be limited. Though simpler solutions such as mobile backup should have broader appeal, especially when that backup connection is 5G. But operators need to think beyond simply selling connections if they're going to really support remote working. They need to think how they can make existing connections perform better and more securely. Some of the options for this are listed here, and they range from offering higher speeds, different types of SLA, and low-cost remote working solutions to a full-blown SD-WAN solution for the home. I'll talk more about these options in tomorrow's session on business services. The change in the way of working raises plenty of problems that business customers need to solve, so creates plenty of opportunity for operators. These opportunities are closely related to connectivity, and so operators are well placed to help, but they are different from the traditional business of simply selling connections. Let's sum up then before we get to the Q&A. So on the first point, much of the impact of COVID should be relatively short term. This is all dependent to a large extent on a successful rollout of a vaccine. Assuming that happens, as looks likely, the areas of decline in 2020 should provide growth in 2021. On the second point, the pandemic has helped accelerate older trends. The importance of convergence for operators has been reinforced, for example. Operators should be well placed to help customers in many of these areas. Finally, the disruptive trends look more challenging for operators. Some of the factors here are beyond an operator's control, perhaps most notably on the overall economic performance. But new opportunities are emerging. Operators may need new ways of working to address them, though. Now, I'll hand back to David for the Q&A.
Thank you, Tom. And let me say thank you also to Stephen for the presentation, and thank you to everyone who has submitted questions throughout the presentation. You can still submit questions, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. However, as I mentioned earlier, if we don't get to your question specifically, a member of our team will follow up with you directly after the event. So I can see here we've had a great number of questions, and I've selected a couple that I think would be good for the presenters to answer. Here's an interesting one. I quite like the way the delegate has posed this question. Which operators do you think have had a good crisis?
We probably
shall I start on that one and then hand over?
Okay.
Good. Sorry, Stephen, I can't hear you. Do you want to say that again?
Okay,
I'll just start on that one and then hand over to Stephen. Yeah, I think it is Stephen, you go.
Okay. Well, we highlighted a few earlier in terms of revenue and profitability. I think it's probably worth recalling Deutsche Telekom that actually increased its guidance for profitability in the year. I think it's very much depends on the country exposure. So I think if you're looking at reporting across some of the big groups, Telefonica or Vodafone or Deutsche Telekom, it's interesting to see how some countries have done better than others. So Spain, UK, pretty badly hit. Germany done okay. Brazil not so good. I think it's quite interesting to see how the Middle East has fared relatively well. I was concerned that population changes plus the oil price crisis hitting the economy could have really ended quite badly for some of the operators in that region. But Etisalat's done reasonably well. STC's done reasonably well. Sorry, Tom. Back to you if you want to add any more comments to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, when you look at the operator reaction to the crisis when it first hit most countries sort of March, April time, I think most operators did a pretty good job of just in the way they responded for businesses, I think also for consumers. So in terms of adding larger data allowances, being a bit more flexible on payment terms and things like that. So in that sense, I think a lot of operators actually did themselves quite a lot of credit and did quite well in their response to what was happening. In terms of the operators that have actually done well, I mean, certainly from a business perspective, as you saw on the chart earlier, none of those big operators did particularly well. Some did worse than others, but all of the major incumbents saw some sort of decline in revenue. This is in contrast to some of the smaller ones. So if you look at, say, Gamma, so Gamma, UK, relatively small UK operator, focused more on the SMB market. So you might think, given that the crisis has hit that end of the smaller companies worse, that they would have had a bad time, but it's actually quite the opposite. They did very, very well. They had very strong growth during 2020. So in a sense, it's what we saw in 2019. So the smaller operators were doing better than the bigger operators, but the difference has been stretched out with those smaller operators doing even better. Probably because they've been able to respond quicker, more flexibly to the customer needs. So we've heard of customers, say, moving contact centers from a single location to people working at home, and they've had really needed operator support to do that. And I think in some cases the smaller operators have done a better job. David, back to you for the next question.
Great, thank you very much. Stephen, I think this question probably sits very well with your area of research. So a delegate has asked and has made reference to the fact that we mentioned earlier in the presentation that some operators have better digital experience strategies than others. And the delegate would like to know which ones are doing well.
Okay, yes, thanks for that question. Well, we take a close look at the customer in view of how operators are doing on digital experience. So we've got lots of primary research that records the customer experiences of what they think about customer service, about pricing, about the network, about the Selfcare app, and so on. There are some pretty consistent strong performers in that we see rising to the top over the years. So O2 UK does a very good job of being customer centric, and that's borne through in its general customer experience, digital experience. Turkcell always does really well as a fantastic digital operator that customers rate very highly. Going further afield, AIS does very well in Thailand, maybe not on many people's radars, but they're an interesting operator that are worth looking into. They're doing a lot right on digital. They've managed to move a big portion of their customer base onto the Selfcare app, also sort of self-provisioning in kiosks and so on. I think so Vodafone is often associated very strongly with digital experience, and it's been a big part of their strategy, partly to address some challenges that they had in customer services over the past few years. And I think certainly during our research, it's taken a while for us to see the positive effects of that, but certainly this year, in the 2020 data set, Vodafone do seem to have improved on this side, and I wonder if some of it is to do with a bit of a relaunch, a bit of an overhaul of their Selfcare app just over a year ago now. So yeah, a few of the usual suspects, but yeah, some really interesting data that we've got through from our work this year.
Stephen. Tom, do you have anything to add to that, or do you think that's comprehensive enough?
I think that's more Stephen's area.
Okay, that's fine. So on that note, there is one I think would be best placed with you, Tom. We've actually had quite a number of questions related to IoT. I picked them specifically because it gives a nice overview and fits nicely with the subject and the theme of the presentation. So a delegate has asked specifically, what impact has the pandemic had on IoT?
Yeah, so it is something we didn't cover in the presentation. We thought about it, but in terms of the trends that we've seen from the operators for IoT, it probably fits into that first category where there's no obvious difference in what's happening in 2020 and compared to 2019. So when we look at things like the number of connections, they are growing steadily through 2020, much as they were through 2019. So from a high level, it looks like IoT is continuing much as it was. Part of that, I think, is because and it's kind of similar to the business sector, most of these IoT connections are under long-term contracts. There may be big contracts for things like smart meters, which have a 5-year contract. There are some changes that maybe we haven't seen so much yet, but I think will filter through in the next year or two. Clearly, the big area for many of the operators in IoT is on cars, connected cars. And the number of car sales has really dropped in most countries. So I think in Europe, it's about sort of 2/3 of the level that it was in 2019. So I'd expect that to hit, particularly in terms of revenue, because those cars quite often relatively high revenue. So that's going to have a negative impact on operators. But from a more positive side, as I've talked about, I mentioned the sort of stimulus funds and the spending there. Quite a lot of digital initiatives. I would expect quite a lot of those to have an IoT component. So we may see some extra spending there that we weren't anticipating before.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. I think we've got time for one more question. And I think both of you could probably contribute to this question as it transcends both areas. So one of the delegates would like to know which area is better placed, consumer or business. So let me read out the question. Which is better placed, consumer or enterprise business units? Tom, if you want to maybe take that first and then move over to Stephen.
Yeah, I'm sure Stephen could talk to the consumer bit. I mean, it seems to me that the consumer bit, the core of the consumer spending is pretty solid. People aren't going to be dropping their fixed broadband connections now more than ever that they're needed. Mobile spend probably also a little bit down on things like roaming, but again, people aren't going to drop their connections. I think it's a bit different, as I talked about in the presentation, from the business perspective. When you look at the number of connections for most operators for fixed connections or mobile connections, the business connections have actually held up pretty well, and they've grown quite often, which is slightly surprising given everything else that's going on in the economy. But they have managed to grow, but clearly usage has been down. Now, I do wonder if and it very much depends on the performance of the economy in the next year. But if we do, in the countries where we're expecting continued recessions, I think we will see quite a few businesses stop trading, and that'll have a direct impact on the number of connections and therefore on the impact for operators. That said, I think there is quite an opportunity for operators to sell other services, complementary services, and I think the opportunity there is probably stronger in the business side than it is on the consumer side. So the things I've mentioned in the remote services, remote access solutions, not seen much from operators yet, but it seems like an obvious one to add. Security, we know a lot of operators are very interested in security, and clearly the security perspective, the security landscape is very different with everybody working from home on different sorts of devices. So there's lots of opportunity for operators to sell those new different services. So it's quite a lot of upside potential from them, but it's still quite a threat to the core connectivity business. Now I'll hand over to Stephen to talk from his perspective.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tom. I agree that the consumer business is sort of a bit of a sort of the steady engine here. Fixed broadband in particular is adds a bit of ballast to the operation. Of course, it's the majority of operator revenue. Mobile is also reasonably safe, I think. So we talked about that broader question of whether spend is going to get knocked with a worsening economic environment. And I think it will be slightly, but we don't see any major overturns. I think one area that's potentially a bit concerning is the likelihood of customers and propensity of customers to upsell to 5G. There's got to be a question of whether increased price sensitivity might potentially sort of slow some of that. And I think there's a challenge for operators, particularly when those points about flexibility that I was making earlier. So customers might be unwilling to opt for a longer term contract. I think there's lots of interesting, exciting areas around the consumer space, particularly in the sort of advanced entertainment area, cloud gaming. We talked about a little bit, and all of those are big opportunities, I think. But they're also very hard fought. That's the challenge for operators to try to work out what's the best role for them, what the go-to-market strategy is. I think we try to bring it out a little bit. Certainly, the pandemic has also kind of highlighted a few other areas that are potentially a bit B2B, but also potentially a bit B2B2C or potentially direct to consumer. And healthcare and education are two big areas that there's a lot of interest in at the moment, and that's certainly sort of changed during the past few months. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Stephen. So let me wrap up and say once again thank you to both our presenters today, Tom and Stephen, and thank you to everyone who attended and submitted questions. There are a lot of questions we just simply don't have the time to get through, but as I mentioned, a member of our team will get back to you after the event. Now, next up, we have 4 concurrent breakout sessions that will be starting in just under 30 minutes. You can navigate back to the event homepage to view all 4 sessions, and you can decide which session you would like to watch and listen to live. Do keep in mind that all 4 sessions will be available on demand later today and for several months. And on that note, I'll say thank you and hope you enjoy the rest of today's event.